This meeting is called to order. With 7 members present, we have a quorum. Good evening and welcome everyone to this meeting of the Planning Board. The Consolidated City and County Planning Board serves in an advisory capacity to both the City Commission and the County Commission. This evening, we will be holding a meeting on the Helena Valley Planning Area zoning regulations and map. I'd like the board members to first introduce themselves. I'm Gregory Thomas, Chair.
I'm Vice Chair and representative of the city.
Representative.
Lois Steinbeck, I'm a representative of the county.
Ken Evans, representative of the county.
Morgan Anderson, representative of the city.
Quinlan O'Connor from the city.
We have a number of county staff with us tonight. I'll ask Mr. McNally to introduce himself and the staff that will be assisting with tonight's meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Karen, am I coming through that mic, that speaker? So my name is Greg McNally. I'm one of the planners for the Community Development Planning Department. Next to me is Mr. Peter Italiano, the Director of the Community Development Department for the county. To my right and next to our chair is Karen Rutherford. She'll be moderating the Zoom platform we have operating today. And to Mr. Italiano's left is Chris Cronick. She'll be taking notes when we have public comment tonight. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McNally. Before we begin our first agenda item tonight, Mr. McNally, will you please explain this evening's procedures?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us here in the Great Northern Hotel in this conference center. We are meeting in this space to afford us the opportunity to participate in your local government and to be socially distant from each other. We are also hosting this meeting electronically via Zoom. We ask that you be patient should we have any technical difficulties with this platform. While this is multiple meetings where we've done this, this is our first meeting here in this space. So again, please forgive us if we have some technical difficulties. For those of you that are participating via Zoom, we ask that you keep your microphone muted throughout the meeting unless you are acknowledged and unmuted by the meeting host. This meeting is being recorded and all public comments will become part of the permanent public record. Comments may be made as an audio statement when the host unmutes you. Once called upon, please state your name and address for the record. We also ask you to join with an appropriate screen name. Some people are also participating via phone. If you have joined us by dialing in and would like to make a comment, when that time comes, please press *9 to raise your hand. And when you hear the prompt, you have been unmuted. Please slowly state your name and address and make your comment. When you are done speaking, our moderator will return your call to muted. You may raise your hand again by pressing *9, and all participants will have an opportunity to speak before previous commenters are allowed to speak again by permission of the chair. We have Ms. Cronick at the computer on my left to summarize your comments. Before you are done speaking, we'll be asking you to verify that we have summarized your comments accurately. And because we have a live audience and others participating electronically, when it becomes time to provide public comment, we will try to alternate between live and electronic participants. And Mr. Chair, if you would be so kind when we get to that point to remind me and I can remind the Zoom participants how they can participate. For those in the audience, we have provided a microphone which we will disinfect with the spray in between use. We respectfully ask that you maintain 6 feet of separation between others for safety. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McNally. The procedures that we will follow in this meeting are as follows. Number 1, the board will hear a brief presentation from staff. 2, as time allows, the board will then hear and/or receive written comments from the public, including proponents, opponents, neutral parties, or anyone wishing to make a general statement or comment on the agenda item. Public comments may be presented in any order Once everyone has had an opportunity to speak, the public comment portion of the meeting will be closed. 3, the board will then hear brief final comments, statements, or recommendations from the planning staff. The board may at any time question any person about their statements or comments. The first item on our agenda tonight is the Helena Valley Planning Area Zoning Regulations and Map. I'll now turn the floor over to Director Italiano.
Good evening. Good evening, Chair and Planning Board members and members of the public. Tonight, Greg and I will be tag teaming, but Greg is going to kick it off with the PowerPoint presentation that is already up on the screen, and we'll go from there. So, Greg, if you want to take it away.
Mr. Chairman, I'm having a hard time hearing both staff members. So either would you speak directly into the mic or turn up the volume? I don't know if anybody else is having a hard time.
We're having a hard time here too. It seems like they trail off at the end of the sentence and we can't hear them. I appreciate that. If that's the case, please raise your hand and I'll try and make sure I don't do that. I want to make sure you can hear me. So you have up on the screen a PowerPoint. I'm going to do a brief presentation, board members and chair. We have before you the Helena Valley Planning Area Zoning Regulations and Map. That's what we're discussing tonight on tonight's agenda. The Helena Valley Planning Area was established years ago, but is also included in our 2015 update to our growth policy. And in the boundary of that Helena Valley Planning Area, which is the black boundary that is surrounded with the green here, there are 3 different growth areas in this planning area. The rural growth area, or RGA, the transitional growth area, or TGA, and the urban growth area, or urban growth area, or UGA, excuse me. And today you have before you zoning regulations for all 3 of those districts. However, at this point, we're creating the districts, or proposing to create the districts for the RGA, the TGA, and the UGA, and we have regulations proposed for the RGA at this point. There is a map that was produced on April 13th, 2020. This is our latest map. We went through several iterations of a map over beginning in, I believe, September, Mr. Italiano. Correct me if I'm wrong. And this is the last draft of that map that would be included in these zoning regulations. You'll notice in the planning area there are several areas that are near the edge of the planning area that are in white. Those areas are properties that are half in the planning area and half out of the planning area. And we chose to exclude those from the zoning regulations because they're not fully within the planning area. So they've been excluded. There's been considerable amount of public participation and outreach. As we presented on June 16th, we held multiple agency meetings, both with local, state, and federal agencies. We've held public listening sessions throughout the valley. We did courtesy notices of these meetings, including social media, flyers, press releases. The first meeting was where included the courtesy notice to give folks the opportunity to come to our website to learn more information about what we were doing. We've had several work sessions and meetings. We first met on June 16th on 2020 when you first started taking public comment. We scheduled then a meeting on June 18th. That meeting was canceled because we heard from the board prior to that meeting that we wouldn't have full attendance or quorum of attendance. We canceled that meeting. Mr. Italiano and I waited outside the Civic Center where that was supposed to be. And in the event that anybody that came, we could speak to them personally. June 25th, 2020 was a work session that the board had. We also had a Zoom work session on July 17th. The chairman asked for that. He was wanting us to preview some of the material that we be presenting at the July 21st meeting, and suggested that we invite the board members to that and that we could do that via Zoom. So we did have a work session via Zoom on July 17th. And then we held a work session on July 21st, at which point a motion was made to make a recommendation on the zoning regulations and map today on August 4th. So that's what we're here for today. You've been given quite a bit of material over the course of this time, and I just wanted to kind of briefly go through some of that. I've got it up here with me as well, as I imagine most of you have it with you as well. On June 16th, you were provided a staff report dated June 11th. It included an Exhibit 1, which is a resolution of recommendation. That resolution had some exhibits. They were Exhibit A, the regulations drafted on April 14th, 2020, and Exhibit B, some proposed amendments to those regulations. Furthermore, it contained Exhibit 2, which was the public comment that we had received up until June 10th of 2020. And we also provided an addendum to the planning board packet. That was your first addendum, which also included some agency comments that we had received, as well as some additional public comments that we had. And all this stuff is available online as well. So we've provided it online as we've produced it for you. The second addendum, which is a summary of verbal comments that were provided at your June 16th, 2020 meeting. Written comments that were submitted at the June 16th, 2020 meeting. As you might recall, several members of the public got up and provided you handwritten comments, and those were included in the second addendum. The third addendum, which included written comments received after the June 16th meeting in our office and up until June 25th, 2020. I also kept a telephone log of calls from people asking questions, and I provided those in the addendum as well. And each time I give you another set of information, I give you that updated telephone log. For the July 17th and July 21st work sessions, we provided you a staff report dated July 14th. It included Exhibit C, which were some proposed amendments to the regulations dated July, and that was dated July 14th. And that document included a lot of amendments that this board discussed through their work session at the 25th. The fourth addendum was written comments received after noon on June 25th, 2020, and up until noon on July 21st, 2020. And again, an updated telephone log. Jerry, how am I doing here on sound? Good? Thank you. August 4th. So you've been provided for this meeting a fifth addendum, and that addendum includes an updated resolution. Excuse me. An updated resolution. So we originally provided you a resolution with the June 16th staff report packet. This is an updated resolution that reflects some of the additional materials you received and the additional meetings we've held. Exhibit D, which is a single proposed amendment to the draft regulations. Board member Quinlan O'Connor, you asked a question about the non-conforming lots and suggested that maybe that language could be a little clearer. So the language that we propose to amend involves that non-conforming lots and is included in that Exhibit D. So just one amendment there based on some of that discussion that we had at the July 21st meeting. I also included written comments that we received afternoon on that day of July 21st and up until July 30th when I provided that addendum. Some written comments. We went through all of our written comments that we had. We wanted to make sure we had given you guys everything we had received because we've got quite a bit of comments that we received. So we went through each individually to make sure that you had gotten them previously. And we did find three. The first was comments from Lucy Morel Gagler. She's a planner in the city of Helena. She had provided us comments, an email very early on when we first drafted the regulations. And we've discussed that previously with this board, but I think you get to see, I provided that email for you now. The other comment was an individual who provided comments attached in an email. That email was included in your prior packets, but the attachment was not. And so this time that email has been provided as well as that attachment that was referenced. And then finally, we received a comment form on June 26th, or I'm sorry, excuse me, yes, June 26th, that is provided in your packet. We've been taking summaries of verbal comments from the meetings. We've been providing staff responses to those. And you've got those here in this addendum here for the July 17th and July 21st meeting. Again, an updated telephone log. And today I provided and passed around both electronically to you and physically to you today, and posted online a summary of the verbal comments that we received on June 25th. I wanted to remind the board of kind of where we're at. The City and County is a consolidated planning board. The planning board has a keen role in developing our growth policy, which this board was involved with in updating our 2015 growth policy. Our county commission took a recommendation for you guys from this board to update that growth policy and adopted it in March of 2016. Part of that growth policy does call for zoning in the rural growth area as we've proposed, and the county did initiate that zoning, and the county commission has directed this board to make a recommendation on zoning regulations and a map. So you have before you today that call to make that recommendation. Once that recommendation is made, the county commission holds a public hearing, and then after their public hearing, they decide to implement or not to implement the zoning. I do have the statutory language that brings that in, section, excuse me. Section 76.2.204 does describe the role of the planning boards. Board of County Commissioners request this board to recommend boundaries and appropriate regulations for the Helena Valley planning area. And we did provide a draft motion for you. And the draft motion is in the affirmative. So I move that the Consolidated City and County Planning Board approve Resolution 2020-01 along with its exhibits A, B, C, and D. And I will speak to you really briefly about what those exhibits are. Exhibit A is the regulations that were prepared on April 14th, 2020. Exhibit B are the first round of amendments that we provided to the board on June 16th. Exhibit C is the second round of amendments that we proposed or provided to the board as a result of the June 25th work session. We provided that prior to your July 17th and July 21st work session. And Exhibit D, which is the exhibit that is in your most recent addendum, which includes that one single amendment regarding non-conforming lots. So I move that the Consolidated City and County Planning Board approve Resolution 2020-01 along with its exhibits A, B, C, and D to recommend to the Board of County Commissioners approval of the Part 2 County Initiated Helena Valley Planning Area zoning regulations and boundaries. Mr. Chair, members of the board, this is an opportunity, the public does have an opportunity to provide comment this evening. After that public comment is provided, per the request of Dennis Dean, another board member who couldn't be present this evening, he asked that we make sure we provide some draft motions and some direction about motions. So I provided a bit of direction for this board that I can go through when you get to that point. But essentially it's that main motion, which I just read into the record, as well as how that gets seconded. The board can have some discussion. And then after that, if the board would like to entertain additional changes or amendments to the regulations, they can then begin to make individual motions to do so. And then after that's done, then you can go back to your main motion and amend it accordingly and vote. That concludes my presentation. And again, Mr. Chair, we will take questions from the board if you open that up.
Thank you, Mr. McNally. Does the board have any questions for staff at this time?
Mr. Chairman, Greg, could you please address each of the items that was noted in Lucy Morel Gangler's comments to you? I know some of them have been included in the addendums you've given us, and some of them haven't, but if you would address each of those, please, I would appreciate it. I found them very helpful.
Mr. Chair, members of the board, I indicated that we did receive comment from Lucy Morel Gigler. She's a planner with the City of Helena. Early on in the process, she emailed us back on April 22nd. She asked that we maybe include definitions of apiculture and silviculture in the definition section, since they're not commonly known terms. We decided that we didn't need definitions for those, that we could proceed without those definitions. She had made comments about the primary, there's the ability to have multiple dwelling unit residents in the conditional use, which is a single building containing 3 or more dwelling units. And she asked, what about multiple detached cottages on one lot in these definitions? And we spoke to her about that and let her know that we weren't looking at that. We were looking at that for the duplex dwelling. You might recall that Mr. Kim Smith commented in a similar vein at our last meeting. There's another question about fences and walls are not allowed in the front setback. And we did actually take note of that question and did recommend a change to allow fencing in the front setback. And so that's in the first round of proposed amendments. Did I cover all that?
Let's skip the one about multiple, it's a long list of conditional uses. If there are 48 or something.
Yeah, she just commented that there is a long list of conditional uses, and we do have a long list of conditional uses proposed. And again, we're anticipating that conditional use chapter is something that we also use when we actually have zoning in place, regulations in place for the transitional area as well as the urban growth area as well. So we're in preparation for that.
Does the board have any further questions for staff? Okay, hearing no further questions, we will go ahead and open the floor to public comment. We'd like to first hear from individuals who have not yet had an opportunity to comment about this subject matter in previous meetings.
Okay. Yeah, my name is David Brandon, 6705 Alvey Drive. It's in the valley. I think it's probably in the transitional area. Speaking about that, but also I do own land in Helena City proper, so we're all kind of one family, I think, the city and the county. So we all have things that we need to cooperate with. One thing, just on the premise of this, unless something has changed, there's very little about use. Zoning. Just a little bit about me. I've developed real estate in Butte Silverbow, in Missoula County, in Billings, and in Lewis and Clark County. Okay, so I know a little bit about development, know a little bit about zoning. I've actually kind of liked the fact that we have had, very little zoning in Helena Valley. That is something that, again, some of the local people got together and have done zoning, and that's fine. They have their own individual neighborhoods, and that's been, successful, and they've been able to control uses and things like that in their neighborhood. The kick that I get here is that, when you have 10-acre minimums, I don't understand how that controls your use. And I know use is going to come down the line, but I think that on its face should be eliminated, because you shouldn't have to have 10-acre minimums. A lot of people, myself included, I have several 70-acre tracts. If I'm limited to 10 acres, it might be perfect, but chances are it won't be. So just limiting that is like a taking, and I'm fairly sure there will be litigation based on that, because it's really hard to show how that's arbitrary. 10 acres is somehow a benefit to the whole of the Helena Valley, which is miles and miles of land, and to say that everything is 10 acres or 20 acres if you get outside that transitional area is just don't know how that got in there, but it has nothing to do with use. Zoning is about use. It's not about another subdivision restriction, which is all this is. It's another subdivision restriction. So that on top of an already burdensome subdivision process. So that's my comment. Any questions from anybody? Thank you.
Would anyone else who has not already addressed the board like to speak now? We'll now open the floor to any public commenters who have already previously addressed the board about this subject matter.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board and staff, my name is Jerry Hamlin and I reside here in Helena. I have spoken several times. I think this is my third time here, so I'm not going to bore you with all my previous comments. I hope that all of you had a chance to take a look at them, analyze them, think about them, and decide in your own mind whether they're worthy of additional comment during this period of time. I hope at least some of them were. One of the things that I find puzzling tonight is, unless I couldn't hear, I can't read the board from back where I am, so there might have been something there I could have missed. But is there only one motion that has been drafted for tonight's meeting, and that's for approval? Am I incorrect in that, or is that what I heard?
No, we were just showing one motion as an example. There will be multiple motions will be discussed this evening.
Okay, that clears that one out. Under definitions, we talked a little bit about definitions tonight. I spent a lengthy amount of time last planning board meeting talking about what it means when they consider an application complete and sufficient. And right now, it's in the eyes of the beholder. And every beholder has a different opinion. And every opinion takes more time. I was told unequivocally I would not be required to do a CLOMAR, both by DNRC and the former planning floodplain manager. Absolutely have it in writing, it's been in meetings, and yet by the time I was done, we got a new planning or floodplain manager, and all of a sudden a CLOMAR was required. That's 2 years and 6 months into the process. I don't understand that, and I don't understand why we can't define what a sufficient and complete application is. There are no regulations today or guidelines for us as an individual developer to find out what that means. There are none now, There were none when I spent 14 years with my subdivision proposal. And I think any adoption of any regulations need to have that item defined. We cannot leave it up to just the opinion of a few or one person to tell us what that means, because it varies greatly. So I would suggest not doing anything until you get that item defined. Another thing we said, we just talked a little bit tonight about all of the conditional uses. I think the word was there were 48 of them. I have never found a conditional use to be very attractive. Almost in every case, I said last meeting, it has been denied. You spend a month or two going through the process, you pay a big fee, and they deny it because you can't satisfy the requirements under the conditional use. So when they come up and say, we've allowed for a lot of flexibility here through the conditional use process, I don't believe that. I don't think it does at all, and I don't think it's worth putting in there. This overall zoning proposal cannot be approved, in my opinion, the way it is. There have got to be some areas in all of Lewis and Clark County that are developable. These have good roads. There's no floodplain problem. There's no sewer problem. There's no water problem. And yet we're going to say it has to be developed in 10-acre minimums. That is absurd. There's no reason for that to happen. The previous speaker talked about zoning is for uses of land, not for size increments. This is a modified moratorium on subdivision activity at a time when the growth plan itself says we will have an influx of approximately 4,000 people in the next 10 years. Where are we going to put them? This kind of zoning is going to take 50% of the available land to situate for these people who are coming here. We all know that's true. Nobody's disputing that. And then we're going to take 50% of the land out of productive use. That is not planning. That's a moratorium. And we need to treat this as such. So I implore you to take a look at that aspect. And I've already talked, and others have talked about the private property rights of the individual, and they are being usurped in this plan. I urge you not to adopt a resolution to move this on. I would recommend that you consider the possibility of sending this back to the drawing board. It's been on a fast track ever since it started. I don't understand what another few months is going to do to it if it doesn't get implemented. So I just ask that you would really seriously consider not adopting a resolution to pass this on and approve it to the county commission. Thank you for listening.
Mr. McNally, since we have not yet had any Zoom participants want to speak, would you please be so kind as to review the Zoom procedures again?
Mr. Chair, members of the board, and those participating via Zoom, if you'd like to comment now would be an opportunity to do so, and you can notify our Zoom moderator, Karen Rutherford, that you'd like to comment by pressing *9 on your phone or clicking the button to raise your hand on your computer. And we can give them a few minutes to do that, because sometimes it takes a while to find that opportunity on the computer to raise the hand.
Meanwhile, do we have any other public comment in the room?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. For the record, Abigail St. Lawrence, again representing the Helena Building Industry Association. We do appreciate the work that the board has put into the multiple meetings so far, and the consideration you have done with these regulations. However, we once again exhort the board to operate their independent advisory capacity under 76-204 sub 1. and to really take under heart not only the minor amendments that you do have in the 3 appendices to the proposed motion right now, but to take under serious consideration some of the other issues that have been raised, particularly for the HPIA folks. There are those serious concerns with the variant CUP and PUD processes, which we discussed at the last meeting. You've heard many times, not only in this meeting, but also in the county's original presentation of this zoning proposal, the concern, and it is a justified concern, about continued impacts on affordability for not only current Helena and Lewis and Clark County residents, but also future residents. I can tell you from the perspective of the home builders, this is certainly a concern that they are actively engaged in. When we are looking at particularly the variant CUP and PUD process, these processes, just as a bottom line, do add to the underlying cost of any kind of housing development. As these processes are laid out in the current zoning proposal, as we discussed last meeting, there is significant lack of clarity. The iterative process adding significant time, and time is money when it comes to housing development, will only impact cost. We really exhort you to seriously consider these impacts. Additionally, as you did hear from some of the previous commentators, the focus of these zoning regulations, not so much on specific types of uses, but rather on the lot sizes within the Helena Valley planning area, do not only limit housing options, but also drive up housing costs. I would ask you not only to consider the impact on the large number of folks involved in the building industry here in our county, which is far more than just the builders themselves, but also, and perhaps even more so, to consider the impacts on our local residents. I've seen now that the average price of a home for the average size family in Helena is upwards of $300,000. And with what we've seen with real estate sale prices and sales activity in the Western U.S. only increasing with recent changes as folks are moving to get out of cities, we're only going to see that continue to expand. And I would ask you to seriously consider what this board can recommend to help address that issue, rather than simply adding on a lot of new regulation that may not necessarily achieve the goals of the growth policy and also have a serious impact on both current and future families here in the Helena Valley and their ability to build a life here. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, we do have Mr. Gowan would like to speak.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. For the record, my name is Bill Gowan, G-O-W-E-N, and I am the Government Affairs Chairman for your local Helena Association of Realtors. I've commented several times in the past, and I thank you for your time again and your efforts. I'm sure that it's probably a little bit cooler in the room than the last meeting we were at, so I hope that's the case. I wanted to echo the comments of the last several speakers. The position that our association has taken is in a detailed written comments that were made. And I would like to get just a little bit more information or direction on how these answers have been posted and directed. The questions that have been posed by multiple folks out here. One of the biggest issues that I came before the board for was the direction of our association, but I also have a personal reason for making comments, and this is more on the personal level as a citizen of this county. I lived in Bozeman, Montana after I was out of college. My wife was finishing. I had a full-time job at a title company. My wife graduated from university. The next day she had a job at the university. And at that time, that was pretty good deal. It was also a time when Bozeman was really growing and pricing went through the roof. We had a young child and we could not afford to buy a home and put our child in daycare and work. So we were forced to leave this state and find work elsewhere. And that is exactly what this 10-acre minimum will do to my son's family and my daughter's future family. Everybody I've heard says this is a bad idea. I don't understand why it's being proposed and why it's carrying on. It is time for you to put this back to the drawing board. No positive motions. Put it back to the drawing board. Let's get a real plan that works for everyone in our community. Thank you for your time.
No.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. For the record, my name is George Harris. I live at 1450 Bighorn Road in Helena, Montana. I am here speaking on behalf as the Chief Executive Officer to the Helena Association of Realtors. I speak on behalf of 355 members and our affiliates, our title companies, our banks, our appraisers, and also on behalf of the official position of the Board of Directors of the Helena Association of Realtors. Mr. Gowan, appreciate his comments. He's our Government Affairs Committee, and the committee has met frequently. We appreciate working with the county, the efforts that have been made. However, we are finding that in spite of unanimous testimony in opposition to this proposal, that it seems to persist on a fast track, which will lead to multiple problems. First and foremost, the Helena Association of Realtors, which I'll refer to as HAR, H-A-R, is opposed to the Helena Valley zoning regulations as drafted. The following position summary, which I have a copy of here, Mr. Chairman, which I would like to leave with the Secretary, summarizes the official position of the Association of Realtors. First and foremost, the draft zoning regulations are so restrictive that the Helena area won't be able to build enough housing for future growth that is affordable to the average household. We just heard testimony of 4,000 new folks coming into the area. Well, from the 2015, according to your the growth development plans, which was put out by the county zoning, we're going to have as many from that time as 20,000 people coming out of that area. Well, Helena Valley is projected by that type of growth. It seems that a 10-acre minimum, which we are absolutely opposed to, is going to cause major problems. It's arbitrary, it's inflexible. It will remove vast amounts of land from development ability, and it will make what little development that can occur unaffordable, as has been testified previously, to the average household. Last meeting, we heard about the water table. We've heard testimony that water that it can be provided, and that there are alternatives, and that we have one of the 15 largest water pools in the world. Facts like this lead us to also believe in terms of the proposal on the cluster design. The cluster lot design as an alternative for developers to achieve more dense development. Well, it's structured in the draft regulation that requires developers to set aside a vast majority of any development parcels in the zoning district for open space preservation. Like the 10-acre minimum, the cluster development option would take a lot of land out of the development pool. Cluster development in general is not a viable option for developers, given the challenges of absorbing the cost of providing services and the infrastructure, which is associated with the ability for the developer to develop larger or denser subdivisions. How will the development community build 4,000 units with a 10-acre minimum? Or even a limited 1-acre lot, allowable under the cluster development option. The next major point is that regulations bypass the hard work of the planning and the growth. The current growth policy for Helena Valley calls for the county to manage growth to establish urban, transitional, and rural areas with development plans to guide northerly growth. The key point in number 8 of the public input states a workshop of stakeholders and regional planners and experts identified the pressing need for cooperation between the city, the county, and facilitating growth in areas around the Helena area where public utilities are available as per Montana statute 76-203. The draft Helena Valley zoning regulations tend to ignore this key point. The county should be doing the hard work. We appreciate the efforts that have been made. We pledge our support and help in the process as we take a look at this. But the lines of the zoning on the map appear to be arbitrary, and why would the county zone for 10-acre minimums in areas that are close to the urban fringe? The county should encourage dense development in those areas while simultaneously developing a plan to extend critical infrastructure to those areas. We understand that this type of plan is very challenging. It stands committed to the work with the county and the city, not only to decide where infrastructure should be, but how it's all going to be paid for. Our next position is that the draft zoning regulations create regulatory uncertainty for landowners, for developers, and the county. One of the key concerns when analyzing a body of regulation is whether they create a specter of regulatory certainty or uncertainty. While there will never be a perfect set of regulations, there are some hallmarks that bolster regulatory certainty, including clarity and defined terms, has been mentioned here tonight. Set process and timelines in the absence of statements not linked to actual regulations and regulatory authority. Definitions, soils of agricultural importance, prime farmland, agricultural soils. The draft zoning regulations, the next point, we also assert that it negatively impacts the rights of property owners. This is a constitutional right. This is a right which has been testified previously and strenuously, which we hope will be considered. The landowners in the proposed zoning area will face burdensome, if not insurmountable, restrictions on the ability to develop their land as current subdivision regulations and the real estate market dictate. Our association helped to fund the public relations campaign to inform the public, and still there's more information needs to be out, and a lot of landowners are indicating that they are not aware of the impact of what's happening. We need to take a deep breath, and our recommendation is that we table this motion, that we work with the stakeholders, that we work with more detail. Our current subdivision regulations are designed to mitigate the impacts of development to protect the public. The main argument for restrictive draft regulations is basically to protect the public health and safety and general welfare. But any regulations must balance these public interests and goals with the interests of the landowners and the business community and the local economy. Mr. Chairman and members of the board, without going into all the details which we have submitted, I will provide copies of this testimony. Again, the Association of Realtors, which is a major force in this community and in this county, are absolutely opposed to the 10-acre minimum. And we wish to be on record to that effect. and we wish to pledge our support. We encourage you to table this motion, to not act on it. And we will support on any stakeholders and work that we can do together. But it's hasty and it's ill-conceived, and it's not going to benefit the average homeowner, and nor the real estate profession or all the ancillary businesses that are affiliated with it. Again, Mr. Chairman, we recognize and appreciate the staff and their hard work. And we know this is hard work, but it's very important, and it has a very large impact. It has many years down the road where there could be some very serious problems if this motion is passed the way it stands right now. That's my testimony, and thank you for your time. And I have copies here, Mr. Chairman, for the record.
No.
Thank you. Do we have any more public comment on this matter before we close the public comment period? We currently have no one waiting on Zoom. Mr. McNally, would you like to repeat the Zoom procedures one more time?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. For folks participating via Zoom, if you'd like to provide comment, now would be an opportunity to do so. To notify our Zoom moderator that you want to provide comment, please raise your hand by clicking the raise your hand button. Or if you're participating via phone, please press *9 to raise your hand.
Meanwhile, we will resume with public comment in the room.
My name is Tom Rolfe. I'm a candidate for the County Commission. I have spoken before, but I've attended, I believe, 6 of your meetings. I've got a question that you might be able to help me out with. The meetings I've attended, there have been over 100 people or 100 public comments opposed to what's going on, to the proposal. But I've only heard 2 comments in favor. Now, I understand you take written comments. I'd like to know if they follow somewhat the same pro and con ratio. Can you tell me that?
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, Mr. Rolfe, we have received considerable amount of public comment. It's all available for the public to review. It's all available to access online. You will see comment in support and against the.
But are they roughly the same ratio of pro and con?
I don't think I ever calculated a ratio of pro or con, but it's
really
all
I have to go on is what I've heard in the public comments. And it would be very difficult for me as a prospective county commissioner to support something that was opposed 100-2 or 100-3. And I think that is a very difficult position you put yourself in. And I know that you're trying very hard to do what you think is the best for our county. And I think your staff, the 2 of you and your staff are good people trying to do the right thing. But I think you've somehow been unable to convince the public of the worthiness of what you're trying to do. And I think it's time to step back and look at it and reconfigure your proposal. And I would encourage that. Because like I say, if it were to come to me and I were on the commission, it would be very difficult for me to support something that had been opposed 100-2. Thank you.
Ms. Rutherford, do we have any Zoom commenters?
We do not, Mr. Chair.
Okay, do we have any further public comment in the room? Okay, at this time, we will go ahead and close the public comment period. And we will go ahead and recess for 10 minutes, reconvening at 7:05.
Yeah,
Board is now back in session. Mr. McNally or Director Italiano, any final words from staff before we move forward?
Good evening, Chairman Thomas, planning board members. Mr. McNally and I are certainly available to address any questions you might have, but at this point, I'm not sure if there's any added value to additional comment.
Does the board have any final questions for staff?
Mr. Chairman, I would like the staff to put up the proposed map that we're considering that show the areas for the different zoning areas, I guess. And I would like them to point out areas of land that do not fall under the 10-acre minimum that are available for denser development, and that probably currently don't have a lot of structures on them. I would like to know if the only developable land is subject to the 10-acre minimum. I'd kind of like to get an idea of land that can be developed that is not subject to the 10-acre minimum.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. So up on the screen is the proposed zoning map. It includes districts for zoning that are proposed in the regulations. The rural growth zoning, the rural residential area, is the area in pink. That's the area with the 10-acre minimum property. The area in green is the area identified. There's two areas, this area and this area here in green. In the growth policy as the transitional growth area, and they're included in the as a district in the regulations without any regulations attached to them. So there would be there's some direction in the growth policy to also look at density controls in these areas, albeit at a higher density. Furthermore, there's direction in the growth policy to look at density controls in the urban growth area, which is the area you see in purple that surrounds the city of Helena. That area also would require some, excuse me, thank you, would also require some density controls, again, at a much higher density. The growth policy talked about this in detail, in fact, did a build-out analysis of, and the number we were talking about in the growth policy between 2015 and 2035. So in that 20-year window, we are anticipating, based on our projections, 4,000 units of housing, 10,000 new people coming to the county into this planning area. And we did a build-out analysis, and we recognized that the urban growth areas present unique challenges to and opportunities for accommodating orderly growth and development. And so the goal of the Helena Valley Area Plan, the growth policy, was to put 60% or more of the new growth that we were predicting, projected to occur in the Helena Valley over the course of that 20-year period between now 2015 2035 in the urban growth area. So we did do that, and that's about 2,400 building units. We did do a build-out analysis of that, and it's in the growth policy. I could bring that up here. As soon as I can bring this down, there we go. We did do an analysis. So the urban growth area, which is this area here in this yellow line and this orange line here, it was comprised of roughly two areas because we matched the city of Helena's urban growth boundary, or urban standards boundary is what they call it.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
You're not sharing that with the Zoom participants.
Oh, thank you. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, and members of the public, thank you for your patience. Apologies, Jerry, thank you. Okay, well, I will kind of mouse over it, hopefully, if that'll work. I don't. Okay. So I just want to make sure I can get this up for the Zoom folks. Would it be all right for you if I point? Is that okay for you guys? So the city had, as I said, they adopted an urban standards boundary, and they had a USB urban standards boundary A and an urban standards boundary B. Urban standards boundary B was to the north, and the urban standards boundary is more closely in relation to the city. So this is the city of Helena here, and then an area outside of the city of Helena makes up their urban standards boundary, which we mimicked in our growth policy. So we were mimicking that process that the city had undergone to establish that boundary, to establish our urban growth boundary. We performed a build-out analysis of that area to see if we could accommodate the number of housing units that we'd like to see grow in that unit. Remember, I said 60% of the growth that we expect, or 2,400 units. And we determined that the urban area, both urban standards boundary A and B, could accommodate 8,843 units. Okay, so that's just in the urban area, not including our transitional area, where we are going to allow for additional density, and not including the rural growth area, where we're looking to lower the density. And all of this is online. Growth policy is online. You can take a look at the analysis that we did, how we calculated that developable land.
Mr. Chair and staff, I'm wondering, could you please remind us how it was that we arrived at the 10-acre minimum lot size?
Part of the goals of the growth policy gives you goals and policies for both the urban standards boundary, the urban growth area, the transitional growth area, and the urban, so rural, transitional, urban. And I'm gonna give a little more detail before I answer your question, but I wanted to show you that working through the public and with the support of many people, including HBIA and HAR, who came to the table and supported this policy, we had a big discussion about how we deal with growth in each one of these three areas. And the focus, and I've mentioned this before, the focus was we looked at 4 different types of things, and they're up here: infrastructure improvements, so improvements to existing infrastructure; density controls, which would be zoning; education, which would be speaking to folks about growth and where they should grow, how they should grow; performance standards, which is essentially our subdivision regulations that we use. And we decided that you couldn't rely on any one of those, essentially what was best was a combination of those 4. Currently, under our 2004 growth policy, at the time of adoption, performance standards is basically what leads the way. That's what guides growth in Lewis and Clark County and the Helena Valley planning area. And through discussion and working with the public, we identified that in the urban growth area, the distribution of these efforts, these 4 efforts, in the urban area should focus on infrastructure improvements. So let's talk about public-private partnerships. Let's talk about targeted investment so we can help guide some growth into this area at the densities we were looking to see. In the rural growth area, let's look at density controls so we can look at a lower density in the rural area where we don't have the infrastructure in place and where we're facing issues with the impacts on roads and the impacts on water and the impacts on fire protection. Let's lower those densities, lessen those impacts, and somehow begin to try and facilitate more of that rural type development in that area. And then in the transitional growth area, let's talk about performance standards. They would lead with infrastructure just behind on facilitating growth at that level of density, that mid-range density or suburban type density that we're already seeing occur in those areas. Let's continue to facilitate that using the standards that we currently have or some additional amendments that we can make to those standards to make growth a little easier. Again, this growth policy document is heavily focused on outcomes of improving growth and facilitating growth in Lewis and Clark County. We are talking tonight about one element of this growth policy, and that's a density control policy to adopt zoning to limit development density in the rural growth area. And in that policy, the suggestion of a 10-acre minimum comes out of that policy. So to answer your question, which all that leads up to that, that's where we get that direction.
I would like staff to address the groups, interest groups, not just citizens who were involved in discussion and in agreeing on the growth policy.
You're asking for who participated in that update?
Mr. Chairman, I would like to know the groups who started and participated in both the 2004 and the update. Not just the individuals that did the Montana Association of Realtors participate in that growth policy review.
So, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, we do have some information about participation in this document. I have to come in and call it out of here. We did make a concerted effort to reach out to a lot of different groups and have discussions with them about the growth policy, the direction that the planning board was looking at going, and get feedback in that process. We had tabletop sessions, presentations, in which a lot of folks from those organizations participated in. And again, there's a public participation chapter in the growth policy that documents a lot of that. And maybe if Mr. Italiano takes a question here or two, I can come back and circle back to that answer.
No way, if the HER said that there was 10 acre minimum and all of that, we know that's not.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board provide any clarification on these statements.
Mr. McNally, do you have any further?
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, when the commission was considering the growth policy for adoption, there was public comment provided by both the HAR representative and the HPIA representative in support of that growth policy at that time.
Mr. Chair, I need to challenge that. HBIA, and I have checked with several of my members.
Point of order. This is not a time for public comment. Anybody who wants to talk must be recognized by the chair and have permission to address the board through the chair. This is a meeting that is run by regulations and organizations and parliamentary procedure, and I, as a board member, would like that honored.
Mr. Chair, there was an incorrect statement made that needs to be corrected. May I correct?
Just one moment, please, Ms. Simmons. So, Mr. McNally, is staff able to clarify, or do we allow Ms. Lawrence to provide her comment?
Well, so, Mr. Chair, and maybe I can clarify that the support that we heard during that public comment period was in support of the document of the growth policy itself. Maybe there were some difference of opinions about certain policies within that document, but in general, we heard some positive support given to our county commissioners for the adoption of that policy.
Does that answer your questions, Ms. Steinbeck?
Mr. Chairman, I think what I wanted to demonstrate is that when the growth policy was developed, there was a broad consortium of people involved in the discussion. Whether everybody supported it, I don't know. But it was not a process that was limited, and it was not a process where people had to, I don't know, work hard to participate in. And I think the public portion or public comment portion of our meeting is over. And if somebody wants to provide documentation to us in written form, I'd be happy to consider it.
Any further questions from the board for staff? Ms. St. Lawrence will have another public comment period before the meeting concludes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I would add that I was on the planning board at that time in 2015 and attended the tabletop sessions and some of the other public sessions. And in my opinion, it was very well organized. There was ample opportunity for all parties to provide input. The board of directors actually were facilitators at each table. Each table had different members from different organizations and community members. And I felt that it was a very open process, and just wanted to share that with the group here.
Mr. McNally, did you have additional comment?
Mr. Chairman, just to clarify and maybe assuage some of Ms. St. Lawrence's concerns, the Helena Building Industry Association, their input is documented in our growth policy, and they did make a number of concerted points. My very general point about that when I made that statement was that when we came up for adoption, one of the individuals representing that organization got up and spoke in front of our county commissioners and had recognized the effort that the board, the planning board, and the county commissioners had proceeded with to adopt the growth policy, and were in support of the direction we were heading. That is what I recall the general direction from that discussion. But there are several points that the HBIA did identify, and we do include that in the public input section of volume 1 of our growth policy update.
Any further questions from the board for staff? Okay, would staff like to add anything else before we move forward?
Nothing further to add.
Okay, thank you. So now we'll move forward to the discussion about motions. This would typically begin with me as the chair asking for a motion from the board members. However, continuing with the consistency of the extraordinary circumstances that we have been working under and have been asked to continue working under and considering these draft regulations, I'm going to start in a non-standard manner by introducing and explaining my own motion and asking if there would be any support for my motion. During the years since Helena became my adopted hometown, I have worked diligently to acquire land and other properties located throughout southwestern Montana, including, but not limited to, Lewis and Clark County. As a landowner and Helena and Lewis and Clark County resident, I must share with you that I have lost a considerable amount of sleep since our board began dealing with these proposed zoning regulations. Two of the many fundamental service offerings provided by my global management consulting firm are public sector risk management and advanced project management. From a high-level project management perspective, an effort of this critical import must actually begin with a business case justification. That document must include, but not be limited to, the following: the results of a zoning socioeconomic impact assessment conducted by a well-qualified, independent, third-party management consultant considered to be a subject matter expert. Socioeconomic data must include, but not be limited to, sustainable livelihood, agricultural, urban, and rural sustainable needs, resource use systems available. For all socioeconomic criteria identified, local communities and critical interest groups, stakeholders must assess whether or not the socioeconomic criteria are critical for zoning regulations or community development. If the criteria are not met, what steps can be taken to determine the best approach to resolve the challenge? Upon completion of the evaluation of the quote-unquote known socioeconomic data, two other actions are critical to assure that the quote-unquote unknown are equally explored and valued. Number one, a questionnaire to the community regarding socioeconomic needs. Two, focus groups on the critical areas that are currently not being successfully addressed. Three, data analysis of a quantitative and qualitative nature to discern meaning of the data. Four, decision analysis process with the decision makers from the RFP to discern where and what zoning regulations need to be changed and the rationale for the change. Five, planning analysis for new or revised zoning regulations with a return on investment analysis to discern the proposed impact of all changes and the problems it shall resolve. And that's an ROI analysis from the county side as well as from the side of the residents and developers. Six, an implementation strategy to assure successful completion using a project management process. I have had an opportunity to review and analyze relevant statistical and behavioral data about the numerous prior similar types of successful lawsuits against Lewis and Clark County during the past 30 years. The negative potential risk exposure for Lewis and Clark County taxpayers in proceeding to implement the proposed zoning regulations without the necessary third-party socioeconomic assessment could rapidly exceed tens of millions of dollars in human resource, legal, court, settlement award, and other related costs throughout the remainder of this decade. To better illustrate the serious nature of poor attention to risk management factors and the significant impact of unintended consequences, here is a current example of what happens when the necessary study is commissioned, but the officials decide to shoot from the hip anyway. The United States Supreme Court's November 27th, 2018 ruling in Weyerhaeuser Company versus United States Fish and Wildlife Service. The Fish and Wildlife Service administers the Endangered Species Act of 1973 on behalf of the Secretary of the Interior. In 2001, the service listed the dusky gopher frog as an endangered species. This required the service to designate critical habitat for the frog. The service proposed designating as part of that critical habitat a site in St. Tammany Parish, Louisiana, which the service dubbed Unit 1. The frog had once lived in Unit 1, but the land had long been used as a commercial timber plantation, and no frogs had been spotted there for decades. The service concluded that Unit 1 met the statutory definition of unoccupied critical habitat because it's rare, high-quality breeding ponds and species conservation. The service then commissioned a report on the probable economic impact of its proposed critical habitat designation. With regard to Unit 1, the report found that designation might bar future development of the site, depriving the owners of up to $33.9 million. The service nonetheless concluded that the potential costs were not disproportionate to the conservation benefits and proceeded to designate Unit 1 as critical habitat for the dusky gopher frog. In writing the unanimous opinion overturning this ruling, Chief Justice Roberts observed that courts are commanded by law to, quote, set aside any agency action that is arbitrary, capricious, and abuse of discretion or otherwise not in accordance with law, unquote. As reported by Helena Independent Record on Friday, January 16, 2015, following our comments made by Commissioner Goodgeesee. Quote, everything we do in subdivisions, we have to be exceptionally careful to follow the language and not be arbitrary and capricious. As a commissioner, I believe it is our job to look forward, learn from the past, to make sure that those mistakes, whether it be interpretation or application of statutes or errors in process, are never repeated. There will always be tension between the county, which represents all of the people who live here, and developers who are in the business of building homes for those people. The challenge is making welcome the new people while making sure people who have lived here a long time have their property rights respected. When running for commission in 2006, Commissioner Hunhausen said his priorities for office included, quote, common sense zoning for predictable and sustainable growth, unquote. It is more important now than ever that all decisions made by our elected officials and our county employees be made in a well-reasoned manner. This can often mean that the wisdom of subject matter experts in the form of well-qualified management consultants must be retained. These experts will perform the necessary assessments and provide us with documentation that either endorses the county's proposed course of action or, instead, points us in another direction with specific actionable steps in the form of a comprehensive work plan to produce holistic, compassionate, common sense, and fiscally responsible regulations that citizens will in fact view as being congruent with the current approved holistic growth plan while providing due consideration for ongoing and future uncertainties. A large number of public commenters who attended the county's 2019 and 2020 proposed zoning meetings indicated that they felt the county, quote, must hire a consultant to perform a zoning economic impact assessment, unquote. Extraordinary geopolitical issues have introduced aspects of socioeconomic volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity into the lives of every Lewis and Clark County resident and stakeholder throughout 2020. Local newspapers and online business publications are abuzz about the rapidly changing Montana real estate market. We are witnessing a record exodus from major metropolitan areas to states like Montana. Instead of once again shooting from the hip because our current draft zoning regulations are, quote, legally defensible, unquote, it is imperative that we urge the Board of County Commissioners to promptly issue a request for proposal to perform a zoning socioeconomic impact assessment. This way, we will have independent, well-qualified, third-party subject matter expert confirmation about whether or not the proposed zoning regulations make dollars and cents for all involved. The assessment results will tell us if the regulations require material revision before adoption to better protect the property rights of all impacted landowners while honoring and respecting the spirit of the adopted holistic growth policy. In other words, if we were to vote this evening to approve Resolution 2020-01 and its exhibits, we would have no idea how much those regulations will cost the county to administer, because no such analysis has been performed, nor do we know how much it will cost residents and developers to comply, because no such assessment has been performed. In an environment where VUCA has turned the world upside down in less than 6 months. And again, VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. Consequently, I am asking this planning board to support a motion to advise the Board of County Commissioners to table further consideration of the proposed zoning regulations and instead recommend that they issue a request for proposal to conduct a zoning socioeconomic impact assessment as outlined herein. And I have further supported this motion with approximately 18 pages of a proposed county planning briefing document prepared by Dr. Andrew Thomas, professor at Carroll College. The floor is now open for either support of this motion or for the presentation of other motions.
Mr. Chairman, did you move the motion?
I was not clear on whether or not that was appropriate since I was the one presenting the motion, since the chair typically doesn't present the motions. Staff, do you have any input?
Mr. Chair, I would suggest you move the motion and call for a second to find out whether there is a second.
Please state the motion in full.
I am asking for a motion to advise the Board of County Commissioners to table further consideration of the proposed zoning regulations and instead recommend that they issue a request for proposal to conduct a zoning socioeconomic impact assessment as outlined within my statement.
Mr. Chair, I would support a second for that.
Discussion of the motion?
Mr. Chair, I've listened for the past several months with as open mind as I can have to this process. I've listened to public comment. I've read public comment as well. I will state for the record that I was not here July 17th or July 21st. And I did watch both YouTube videos, actually yesterday and today. And I just want to state my thoughts. Without development or even robust development, my livelihood and career is in jeopardy. And so I weigh that with what we're trying to do. And I've seen development across the United States where I've lived, and some good and some challenging at times. However, since moving back to my home in Montana and buying a house here in the Helena Valley in the county, I've experienced three things that have kind of surprised me
One, I have a very good friend here who's been a volunteer firefighter for 20 years looking to move. And there are areas in the county he will not even consider because of his background in firefighting and because of what he perceives as a risk to firefighting. So that weighs in. The transportation infrastructure is frightening at times. A 16-year-old son who lost a friend last year on a road that we traverse every day into town. With regards to water, the July 21st meeting that I finished listening to today, there was considerable discussion on my development. And I can speak from an absolute point of firsthand knowledge that we have a quantity and quality problem every day, certainly during the summer months. And there is irrigation involved, so we can debate that, but nonetheless, so weighing that, my livelihood, I have 5 children that I support and a wife, and I do support zoning regulations as written with -1. Just want to state that for the record.
Mr. Chairman, I cannot support this motion. First, I believe we have some excellent subject matter experts on staff. True, we can't quantify everything that you think we ought to be able to quantify, but I think we can identify some problems we know are there now. The number one issue for me is also water. I live in an area where water has been depleted and there aren't even houses every 10 acres. I also have great faith and respect for the growth policy that the citizens of this county and city participated in, and I would not tell them their efforts were not good because they were not subject matter experts and they did not address every technical issue we think they should have. Before I was a member of this board, I thought the growth policy meant something. I thought the area in which I lived would be protected, if you will, by 10-acre lots so that the water on my property wasn't further depleted, potentially lowering my property values. Well, it doesn't mean anything without zoning regulations or without some kind of regulations. The subdivision regulations don't address it. And the water concerns in the North Hills are significant. Maybe not in the lower valleys. I know there are people who don't agree with it, but they don't have a well that's dropped 60 feet in the last 10 years either. I would also like to make one comment for the record. Some of you who've testified before us tonight, I know personally. I know you're honorable people and you would never do harm or intimidate anyone who didn't agree with you. But before I was a member of this board, some folks I know who supported the zoning regulations went to the public meetings and some of them didn't testify because they felt intimidated by the atmosphere in the room. And that part of the atmosphere was the clapping and the support of all the people who did not support the zoning regulations. So for people to assume that because you haven't heard from a lot of people in support of this is not prima facie evidence that there aren't supporters out there. I know of at least 4 people who will not testify because they're afraid of the backlash. Now, as I say, that was before I was a member of this board. And I can tell you before I was a member of this board and involved in testifying to try to protect my property rights, it was intimidating. So I can't support a motion to start over because I think it would be disrespectful to all the citizens of this county and city who participated in the growth policy, and it would be disrespectful to the people who think the growth policy means something. Do I think the process that was followed here was perfect? No. Do I think it was pretty good? Yes. Do I think it was done in a good faith effort? You bet. And I also think that there have been plenty of opportunities for the public to comment and for us to hear it. And I know this board took a lot of actions to react to those comments. And I propose, depending on how the motions go tonight, that we also provide some feedback to the county commission on what we think ought to happen going forward with some zoning and with looking at the growth policy. But I cannot support this motion.
Mr. Chair and members of the board, I guess just a little discussion about why I believe and why I have seconded this. And it isn't necessarily that I believe firmly that we need to do a full socioeconomic analysis. I believe we do have, a lot of subject matter experts. And I believe, as you say, Lois, that we have good staff members and we have done this process in good faith. I absolutely support zoning, and I think that it's something that we need to do. And I think that the growth policy, that we have a growth policy in place, is phenomenal. It's an advisory, visionary document that we all need to support, and we need to make those recommendations to implement the actions that are identified in our growth policy. I don't believe that what we have before us at the moment is fully implementing the intentions in a holistic approach, as Chairman has pointed out, in a holistic approach to the way that we're dealing with this. Water is probably my biggest concern and the reason that I participate on this planning board. What we are doing, as we've stated in the intent, is trying to address the issues of this, and our minimum lot size of 10 acres, in my mind, is not addressing the water issue. I would like to make an amendment on this that actually says, I believe we need to identify the areas in the valley that are appropriate for further development and where we have aquifers that can be recharged and where we can be supporting and we understand what the water resources mean. This proposal is not addressing that. It's, we had someone who mentioned, I believe this is Mr. Hamlin, saying zoning for uses not on the lot size. I believe that the approach that we're taking is not addressing the issues that we are hoping to address. And I would prefer that we take a little bit more of a systematic approach. And if that's from starting with a socioeconomic analysis, because we've heard from a number of people that this is going to create a real burden on affordable housing, I think we need to be able to defend that. We haven't been answering that question to my sufficiently for me to feel comfortable with it. I think we need to address, what does affordable housing look like? Is this going to have a great impact if we're saying a 10-acre minimum lot? So I'm struggling with that, and I'm also struggling that it seems to be sort of one size fits all. I know it's the Helena Valley Growth Plan, Helena Valley, sorry, I forget what we call it exactly, that was identified in our growth policy, but I believe that we needed to make some adjustments to areas where we've heard that there are concerns that this approach and the 10-acre minimum isn't appropriate. So I'm struggling with that. I'm struggling with the water. I'm struggling with the 10-acre minimum lot size, and believe that maybe we don't have to throw the whole thing out, but I think we do need to start over and we need to address some of those issues. And so what I'm primarily supporting is tabling this motion and the recommendation.
Any further board discussion?
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to say I am not in support of this motion either. I feel that we need to move forward with the zoning. I feel that there was a whole lot of effort by this board and the staff in 2015 to put together the key issues report and the updated growth policy. And I think that those are really good documents. it's a little frustrating to me that those don't seem to be referred to often enough, and I appreciate everybody's comments, but I think there's a lot of information in there that got missed in conversation. And regarding affordable housing and that sort of thing, I think Mr. McNally's presentation earlier that showed us the urban growth area that can accommodate up to, I think, 10,000 residents was the number, is very telling and very important. And I think I appreciate you showing that to us and reminding us of that tonight, Greg. I am part of the development community in this town. I deal with zoning all across the state on various projects that we work on. Sometimes zoning can be challenging to work with, but there is a reason for it. Another thing that comes to mind is last summer about this time, I went to a meeting that was at Rossiter School regarding a proposed gravel pit in Helen Valley. And there was a very, very full room of people there who had bought houses, owned houses for decades in some cases, around previously vacant, undeveloped land, and all of a sudden now there's a proposal for a mine to be located there. And I'm a little bit surprised that none of those people came to any of these meetings to speak. Maybe they did, maybe they were intimidated, maybe they don't care. But I think there is a large faction of people out there who do care and probably support zoning and are very interested in what happens on properties around them and around our community. So I am in support of recommending to the county commission that we move forward with implementing the zoning.
Any further board discussion? Mr. McNally, would you please be so kind as to go ahead with a roll call vote?
Can I make a comment?
Comment.
I won't speak for long on this. I'd rather talk about the zoning. I'm opposed to this motion to table based on socioeconomic impact study. I certainly have some concerns about the policy as drafted as well, but I don't frankly think that this particular motion is the tool to make those changes or to recommend modification either to the Board of County Commissioners or to staff. And so I'd rather fail this motion and work on the policy moving.
Mr. McNally, would you like to proceed with the vote?
Mr. Chair, members of the board, and Mr. Chair, maybe you can clarify. I just want to make sure that the motion you moved was to advise the Board of County Commissioners to table further consideration of the proposed zoning regulations and instead recommend they issue a request for proposal to conduct a zoning socioeconomic impact assessment as outlined.
Yes, that's correct.
Mr. Chair, members of the board, I'll do a roll call vote and I'll just state your name and you can say yay or nay. Quinlan O'Connor.
Nay.
Morgan Anderson.
Nay.
Lois Steinbeck. Ann Schwen.
Aye.
Corey Kenna.
Nay.
Ken Demmons. Mr. Chair.
Aye.
Mr. Chair, the motion fails 2-5. Two votes in favor, 5 votes against.
Floor is now open for additional motions.
Mr. Chairman, this afternoon, when I picked up my packet in advance of the meeting, I did not have a copy of the motion that staff prepared. I would also like to make an explanatory comment to members of the public. The first time I watched this board in action and I saw that staff had prepared motions and I saw that they were in the affirmative, I was somewhat flabbergasted because in my previous life, that's not what happened. But in discussions with legal counsel and part of my training for this board, the reason that the motions are drafted in the positive is if they are defeated, they are done. So it is not that the staff may be recommending that. The board is not necessarily asking them to draft the motion in that way, but it is on the advice of counsel that it is done that way. So that really helped me when I was trying to figure out how this worked. But
excuse me, it's in your, in the fifth addendum, it's on the third page.
Mr. Chairman, I see the resolution. I don't see the motion.
Mr. Chair, members of the board, I do have it on the screen, and
I can't read it.
and you can't see it probably. Okay.
Mr. Chair, I'm ready to make a motion. I move that the Consolidated City and County Planning Board approve Resolution 2020-01, along with its exhibits A, B, C, and D, to recommend to the Board of County Commissioners approval of the Part 2 County-initiated Helena Valley Planning Area zoning regulations and boundaries.
I'll second the motion, Mr. Chairman.
Any board discussion for the motion?
Just a clarification, Mr. Chair. It was my recollection that the Exhibit A was in fact the zoning regulations themselves, and that Exhibits B, C, and D were the proposed amendments to that because it was attached to planning board documents, and that's in line with what's listed in the final paragraph of Resolution 2020-01. But just like clarification, if I'm misremembering, that's fine as well.
Mr. Chair, members of the board, that is correct. So Exhibit A is the draft zoning regulations prepared April 14, 2020, and Exhibits B, C, and D are the subsequent amendments that staff proposed to those regulations. And board members, Steinbeck, the draft motions were not provided in your packet. They were only presented here. This is typically how we've done that. We've presented them in this moment here. Just again, it's the board can make the motion as they choose. This is an example we provide, and again, like you had indicated, we offer it in the affirmative for the reasons you stated.
Mr. Chairman, I have one amendment to add a bit of what I consider emphasis on the public participation aspect of this board's meetings. I would move to amend the resolution in two places. The first on page 1, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th whereas. I would add right after whereas, comma, each of. So it would read, each of the planning board public meetings were also hosted electronically via Zoom. I would like to add that to emphasize that this board took action to try to accommodate as many participants, especially during the COVID crisis, as we could. The second part of my amendment to the resolution is on page 2, on the first, second, third, fourth whereas. before the semicolon following process, I would add, and requested changes to the regulations in response to some of the comments that were received. So that would be my motion to amend this resolution.
Is there a second for the amendment?
I'll second.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, I'd like to discuss the second part of that amendment. I think it's important that the county commissioners realized that we listened to the concerns. We haven't addressed all of them, but we listened to some of the concerns, specifically some of the testimony about Remini and specifically some of the written comments that were received. We listened to those and we requested that staff address them. Later on, when we conclude our action, I would like us to consider some further recommendations regarding some of the comments we have heard and some of the concerns we'd like the county commission to address moving forward. So these aren't the only things that I would say that we will raise for the county commission. Some of them will not be part of the regulations, but what we would like to see happen in response to some of the comments that we have received.
Mr. Chair, we're trying to follow along with the motion. And was the motion seconded?
Yes.
Thank you. Who seconded the motion? Just, was it? Okay, thank you. And may I clarify the language that you had requested to add? So in resolution -2020-01, the seventh whereas, you're asking to have that lead with whereas, and then each of, okay? And then on the second page of that resolution, there would be, beginning at the first whereas, the fourth whereas down, you would have that language to be amended to include at the end of that whereas. Yeah, please. Mr. Italiano can read his
Chairman Thomas, planning board members, Peter Italiano for the record. After the word process at the fourth whereas, I believe, planning board member Steinbeck, it should say, and requested changes to the regulations following comments received.
In response to some of the comments received.
Okay, so Peter Italiano for the record, I'll read it from the top again. Following the word process in the fourth whereas, it would be added and requested changes to the regulation in response to some of the comments received.
Mr. Chair, members of the board, Mrs. Steinbeck, was that correct? That is correct, the language. Okay, thank you.
Any further discussion about the amendment? Are there any additional amendment motions?
Point of order, Mr. Chairman, we need to vote on that amendment.
Mr. McNally?
Mr. Chair, members of the board, this would be a situation, so you have a main motion on the floor, and then now, and that hasn't been voted on yet, but you asked for any other amendments or motions, which Ms. Steinbeck has provided, and you can vote on that individual motion. And then If there are any other motions that are made, we'll vote on those, discuss and vote on those as well. And then you can go back to that main motion to amend it to include those motions that were successful. So, Quinlan O'Connor.
Yes.
Morgan Anderson.
Aye.
Lois Steinbeck.
Aye.
Ann Schwind.
Aye.
Corey Kenna.
Aye.
Ken Demmons.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman.
Nay.
The motion is successful. 6-1. 6 votes in favor, 1 vote against.
So in returning to the main motion, are there any additional secondary motions? Is there any further discussion on the main motion?
Mr. Chairman, I will support the adoption of zoning regulations because I think we need to provide the county commission the tools to implement the growth policy. I will also support them because I believe that they will be a continuing living document, if you will, that I anticipate coming before this board so that we can continue to address the concerns of the citizens that we've heard. I think these are a good first start. I don't think they're perfect, and I do think they will need to be amended, and I will speak to that further. Probably the reason I support these amendments is water availability in parts of the Helena Valley. Some parts are water rich, no doubt about it. Some parts are not. And until we can get better data on which to base subdivision development, the 10-acre minimum parcel is supported by some water availability studies. And absent granular water data that will give us more certainty in development, a 10-acre minimum will be a good place to start in the short term. I also honor the comments about fire suppression, and even though our county has a premier wastewater septic monitoring process, I know other communities in Montana where one failed septic tank, $3 to $5 million cost to the 300 residents who live there. And so if you have lower density, those kinds of issues should have more self-correction than a higher density, particularly out in the more rural areas of our county. So that concludes my comments, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, I would kind of like to go off her comments and say, so why I didn't pass why I didn't vote for the socioeconomic proposals, mostly because I feel like that is a lot of like growth policy work. And that those studies, are done, like that's an extensive endeavor. And then zoning is the tool. That's, the dream for our community. And then zoning is the tool. And we right now are just tasked with looking at this zoning and deciding if it's a tool that we support and will work for us. And I do agree, I don't think that they are perfect, but that's a really high ideal. So much in our community, like in our world, is like incrementalism, and that's how things get done. So I do feel like they'll have to be fine-tuned, but what we are trying to decide right now is if they can at least put us on the track towards the development that we want to see. And so those are just kind of my ideas about this policy, is whether it is a tool that's going to work, and then it will have to be fine-tuned later as we keep going. And we've kind of talked about that with like future iterations of the growth policy. I imagine there will be further iterations of this zoning as well, so.
Any further comments about the main motion?
Mr. Chair, I guess I want to continue to say something about it, because I feel like it is important that we're starting this and that we're honoring the growth policy and that we are initiating implementation and finding a way to do that. I'm just struggling with not feeling like this is the right approach. And I feel like when we say we're going to fine tune it, we're basically creating a system that we already know we need to fix. We're building a house not on a solid foundation. That's my perspective of what's going on, and I'm struggling with it because I do believe in zoning, and I think we have large areas in the county or in the Helena growth area that we need to limit development, and we need to think clearly and have a vision for what that growth looks like. But I don't feel like this tool is addressing that. I don't feel like it's addressing the intent of the growth policy. And I worry that by agreeing to this, that maybe we aren't going to come back and fine tune it, and that we're going to be creating more work in terms of variances and conditional use permits and many of the other pieces of that we've heard come up. I feel like it's going to be creating more work rather than being thoughtful and being deliberate in the way that we're approaching this right now. I don't want this to be the final answer, and so I'm afraid to agree to it or to support it. I really can't in good faith support it, even though I want us to have the tools to do and to guide the growth in the valley that we really need to see, particularly for our resources. So I can't support moving this forward.
I think that's pretty much exactly the struggle I've been having. I think I come out the other way. I think it's more important that we have the zoning policy to start with, and that we do address it from there. But I think I share a number of your concerns based on what you've voiced over the last several meetings. I'm certainly concerned about the clarity and the variant PUP procedures, and I think they're going to need updates. Concerned about dropping the water body setbacks, and I understand the reasons for dropping it, but I don't like, there were good reasons to have them, and I think we're dropping them as a way to avoid fine tuning the zoning policy, and I don't think that that's a very good reason to drop them. I think there are areas where the 10-acre is probably too large an area, and we could have more dense zoning. And so I think all of those things are going to need to be fixed. And I don't like passing, I mean, to the extent that we're even passing, but I don't like recommending the adoption of policies that start from a problematic. At the same time, I think what I hear essentially, and the core of public comment throughout the process is there is opposition, there will always be opposition. And so no matter the amount of fine tuning and careful craftsmanship of the policy we come up with, there will continue to be, frankly, much the same opposition. And so I would rather start from a place where we adopt zoning and frankly immediately start fixing the things that we know need fixing and proceed from there. And I guess that would be my request of staff, and I don't know that we actually have the authority to do this. I think it come from the commissioners, but that we do immediately start working on those next phases of zoning. That it isn't, frankly, even a year from now when we're starting to see redrafting, but that it's immediately that process begins. As much as we all don't like necessarily having these constant meetings. I think it's important that we keep this process moving, that there isn't delay, that it's not 5 years from now before we're seeing redrafts and the more granular identification of issues within the policy that we move forward, so that there is an improvement in the process and it does give people what they actually need and to fulfill the purposes of zoning. So I hope that that's what we see, and I presume that the county commissioners will be reviewing at least some of these records as well as they proceed, and I hope that that becomes what they're recommending as well, no matter what comes of the elections this November. But I will be supporting zoning.
Is there any further board discussion about the main motion?
Mr. Chair, I would just add that I think that the zoning process is kind of intended to evolve over time. I doubt that, for example, the City of Helena zoning ordinances today look very much like they did when the very first version of them was adopted. So I think it's natural for these types of things to evolve and be amended over time, and that's necessary. So I just wanted to tag on to what Quinlan was talking about. Also wanted to clarify that I did attend all of the public meetings with the exception of July 17th, but I did listen to the recording of that work session online earlier this week.
Mr. McNally, looks like we're ready for a vote on the main motion.
Mr. Chair, members of the board, Mr. Chair, might I recommend you request from the individual who made the main motion, Board Member Corey Kenna, whether or not he would accept the additional amendment that was presented and passed by this board regarding amendments to language in the resolution, and that main motion was seconded by Ms. Steinbeck. So just to see if those two agree.
Point of order, Mr. Chair, the amendment has already passed. Therefore, what we ought to be considering is the motion as amended.
And the second agrees to that. That's what I was looking to see. Just that. And thank you. And the second agrees. Just wanted to clarify that we're all clear what we're voting on. So there was an initial motion made. We did not vote on that motion. And then there was an amendment that passed, a motion that passed for amendments to the resolution. And I simply just want to document that the main motion reflects that amendment that did pass through voting.
Point of order, the maker of the motion cannot decide whether or not the amendment is attached. The amendment by majority vote is now part of the main motion. So the vote we would be taking on is the motion as amended.
I feel comfortable that we've discussed that and everybody is aware of where you're going. So the main motion, again, was to move that the Consolidated City and County Planning Board approve Resolution 2020-01 along with its exhibits A, B, C, and D to recommend to the Board of County Commissioners approval of the Part 2 County Initiative Helena Valley Planning Area Zoning Regulations and Boundaries. And then that there was an additional amendment that passed that also included amendments to the resolution from Board Member Steinbeck. And I will read by board members names of the record for a vote. Quinlan O'Connor. Morgan Anderson. Lois Steinbeck. Ann Schwab. Corey Kenna. Ken Demmons.
Yes.
Mr. Chair.
Nay.
Mr. Chair, the motion has passed 6-2. 6 in favor, 2 against.
Moving on with the agenda, is there any other business? Steinbeck?
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, I would like to put forth a proposal, and I will provide it as a specific motion, but if I could explain it first with your indulgence. I would like to provide some feedback to the Board of County Commissioners about the next steps we think as a planning board that should be followed in addition to these zoning regulations. And it would address some of the concerns that board members have and some of the concerns that we have heard from people who testify. The first thing I think would be important that I would like the County Commission to consider is providing adequate funding and, if we needed, additional staff resources to begin updating the growth policy immediately. The second thing I would like to include, and I would like more comments from board members, is as part of the update of this growth policy, I think there's some things that need to be looked at. One, we know that we need more granular zoning districts because we know there are areas of development within this large rural area, Bob's Valley Market, maybe the area out by Red Fox, maybe some other areas where the density is already there for a more urban-like setting where a 10-acre minimum within certain restrictions around those areas may not make sense. So something more granular there. We know that there are concerns in Remini that we're not able to potentially adequately address. And so that would be another granular zoning area that we would like to look at. We've heard a lot about affordable housing. And I think the growth policy ought to take a real hard look at how we facilitate, whether it's areas within the county and planning within the county, which involves infrastructure, by the way. So that would be something that the county commissioners would be really interested in. But my idea is that we would say, okay, we approve these zoning regs, but we think more work needs to be done. And one of my very first things, I think we need to ask them to invest in more hydrogeologic studies in certain parts of the North Hills, because I think water availability in the whole rural area, in the whole rural growth area, is not the same. And it's really important we figure that out. It's important for developers, it's important for realtors, it's important for people who already have property there. So I don't know if the planning board has ever kind of made a recommendation and then followed it up with, gee, here's what we as a board would like to see as next steps. But that's something I would put out for your consideration, because I've heard my fellow board members' concerns. I've heard them, and I think they're real, and I think we should try to address them. And I don't think we should leave this as the final answer. And I think we should try to get direction to pursue some more granular look at this so we can address some of the concerns that we've heard. So I don't have a motion because there's a lot of thoughts there, but if we wanted to take kind of a group effort at laying out the issues we'd like to see in terms of our recommendation going forward with the zoning regs, I would really like to forward something like that to the county commissioners with our recommendation.
I would just suggest that it not wait on the growth plan, our work out. What we've heard from staff is that that's likely to take hold. And so I think I agree it should be passed along with our recommendation. I guess my inclination is that we could just ask staff to, or ask staff for a recommendation. I understand our next meeting is already full up, but perhaps at the meeting after that we talk about next steps with zoning, even within this zoning, county is, so I suppose if the county doesn't approve this initial zoning, it may be we're here tonight. But I guess my inclination, you've been nodding throughout this, Italiano, is that maybe we could just ask you to pass this along, and you could do that.
For the record, Peter Italiano, Douglas, Community Development Planning, Planning Board Chair and Planning Board members, and Mr. O'Connor, absolutely, staff hears you loud and clear. We'll pass that on to the commissioners. I also want to state for the record, you know, if not for some of the challenges that staff has been facing with regard to COVID, we probably would have already at this point had fleshed out written regulations for at least the urban section of the draft regulations, if not both the urban and the suburban. So we're working on that as we speak and hope to have that to you possibly before the end of the year. On another issue that seems to be somewhat of a recurring theme among some of the planning board members tonight, this idea that the action you're taking and the document that may be ultimately approved by the county commissioners is a one and done. I want to assure you that that's nothing could be further from the truth. I think, as Corey mentioned, you know, if we look back a couple decades at what Helena's first draft looked like compared to what it is today, you know, there's probably no semblance there at all. And in this document that you've made a motion on tonight, I would call your attention to the section called rezoning. And it's specifically intended to, in fact, address an ongoing process to update the document. Also, with regard to the idea of creating a more fine-grained approach to the rural area and the 10-acre density, that's already built in what you recommended tonight as a plan development section. Again, it's not fleshed out. We're working on that. Once you see that, I think you'll see that that creates an opportunity within not just the rural, but also the other suburban and urban sections to hone in on a particular area and come up with a creative plan that addresses the impacts, mostly of those 5 key issues. So another way of saying that without soloing around the barn is, as Planning Board Member Steinbeck mentioned, if there are areas that have adequate water, for instance, and one of the criteria of the 5 key issues with regard to the 10-acre density is water, through the PD process and the rezoning, we can look at that more fine-grained, you know, potentially have additional hydro studies done. And if it can be shown that a higher density than 10 acre would not adversely impact the water for that area, we would support that. Of course, the other 4 key issues would also be looked at as applicable. So that's what I wanted to add, but we'll certainly pass your comments on to the county commissioners.
Lois, were you thinking that we would actually draft something up to send along, perhaps to the county commissioners? And I appreciate, Peter, you indicating that you would pass that along, but I would like to see something, if we are indeed doing that, to really write it down and have a recommendation that goes along with this resolution and the motion.
Mr. Chairman, I heard these folks, and I know that we need to address a lot of the issues. We may not address them perfectly, but we need to address some of the issues that were brought to our attention. And I share other planning board members' concerns. I think the recommendation to not wait on the growth policy is a good one. But I think we need to start fleshing out some more granular areas where we know, first of all, that water is available. It's not an issue. And maybe plan it around areas that are already more densely developed where water is not an issue. And I think we do need to address the little urban area that's coming out around Bob's Valley Market. I think there are going to be more places there of business, and you know, how big do you have that area? Because there's other areas out there. I'm on a neighborhood email chain, and people are commenting about how they might not be able to flush their toilets at night. They can't water their lawns now, and it's out in the area, east of or west of Montana Avenue, out just directly almost west of where I live. So there are water issues that are out there now. Now, they're not everywhere in this planning area, but there are some extreme water issues. And I would love to be able to identify where those are to protect both people who are going to buy property and build houses in that area, as well as those of us who already live there. So, and I would like to have something formal to the county commissioner, because I think the things we've heard are important. We may not be able to address all of them in exactly the way the public wants, but I think we should make a good faith effort to address as many of them as we can.
For the record, Peter Italiano, Chairman Thomas, what I would suggest, we have another planning board meeting coming up in a couple of weeks. I believe it's the 18th. And if planning board member Steinbeck wants to flesh out some of her comments, I've written them down. I can certainly take a shot at them and send them to you, and we can go back and forth and then circulate them amongst the planning board and then bring them back on the 18th for the planning board to consider.
Thank you. I was actually going to bring that up because we've been talking about water, but I think there are many other environmental issues that we should probably consider. So it's identifying areas of higher resource values and recognizing what those might be. And I was looking back at the comments once again, and I brought this up before, that we received from Gus Byram. And I think this is probably supporting some of the efforts in the growth policy. But he talks about the creation and conservation of interconnected lands with high environmental values. So I guess I would just, what I would like to support is how we identify, if we identify those areas where we want to see growth occur, and then how do we connect those to the rest of the community, and thinking about that, rather than it just being about parcel sizes, but a broader, more holistic approach that supports the growth policy. And thinking about transportation and trails as well.
Any further board comments? Any further staff comments? Okay, the next meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, August 18th, 6 o'clock, the same location. The floor is now open for public comment on any matter within the jurisdiction of the planning board that is not on the agenda.
Mr. Chair, this is St. Louis, but I apologize. I just want to clarify, Mr. Chair, that you indicated that the same location for our next meeting is actually been noticed to occur in the chambers. We're working, the city county building officials are working to accommodate the chambers so we can have meetings like this in that place. So that's where we've currently scheduled the next planning board meeting, is in that location of the chambers. It will also be held via Zoom. Just to clarify. Sorry, Ms. St. Lawrence, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I appreciate this opportunity. And well, Ms. Steinbeck, I do certainly recognize procedure or parliamentary procedure. You and I are both painfully familiar with that through 4 years, and I care to count at the Montana legislature. I did request permission from the chair and did not receive a response. I apologize for my passion, but when my clients' positions are misrepresented, I must speak to that. I do want to address 3 primary issues that have been raised during the board's discussion. And I particularly appreciate the recognition by members of this board of the needs to have further considerations included in this document that is now being forwarded to the County Commission. And while I do appreciate the additional concerns that are being raised, I have concerns about the legal impact of those concerns when they are not included in the resolution that is being forwarded, but that's neither here nor there. To address the three primary issues I do feel compelled to bring to this board's attention. First of all, in the conversations as to HBIA's involvement and/or consent to or support of the Growth Policy Initiative. If you look at page 35, volume 1 of the Growth Policy, it specifically lays out HBIA's concerns that were brought to the attention of the county during the formation of the Growth Policy. I was quite certain and have confirmed tonight with several of the HBIA officers that while HBIA did participate in conversations with the county while the growth policy was being developed, HBIA as an organization did not support that policy. I understand the policy has gone forward and is now of record with the county. But I do feel compelled to say something about that because these statements are the very reason that, quite frankly, I had to have conversations and have to have continual conversations with the associations I represent about public participation, because they often feel they are in a damned if they do and damned if they do not situation. If they do not participate, they are disregarded because they do not take up the opportunity of the public participation that is offered to them. If they do participate, that participation can be construed as consent or approval. That is not the case. I would not be doing my clients a service if I did not make clear what their position was on the growth policy. Specifically, I would like to call to this board's attention some of the issues that were raised in the comments that HBIA put forward on the growth policy that specifically address the 5 primary concerns that the county raises as their justification for bringing forward this Part 2 zoning in the first place, which are water, wastewater, fire, flood, and roads. HBIA, in commenting on the growth policy, made the following suggestions, and I quote, these are directly from page 35 of the volume 1 of the growth policy. Make road standards more flexible with different improvement levels for different areas, incentives for homeowner mitigation of fire hazards and use alternative methods not limited by water supplies, leave flood controls to DNRC and FEMA, but develop a valley-wide stormwater plan, extend water services in phases to the areas where development is best suited, and build a new sewage treatment plant in the lowest parts of the valley. HBIA remains supportive of these suggestions. Secondly, I do feel the need to address the issues that were more broadly brought up in the conversation here about participation, and particularly reasons why folks who may have had concerns about the gravel pit, that Montana Department of Environmental Quality is dealing with out in the valley are not present. I can understand why they wouldn't be here, because these regulations are dealing primarily with lot size, not with specific uses. When I have had an opportunity to review many of the other Part 2 zoning that has been initiated by other counties throughout Montana, that zoning has focused on specific uses, not on lot size. The lot size focus of these proposed regulations do not go to addressing the limitations on uses so that folks who bought their dream home out in the valley don't then have a pig farm moving in next to them. Third, and finally, I want to address the water issues that have been the conversation, the topic of not only much conversation tonight, but in previous meetings. As some of you may know, water rights has been a huge portion of my 16-year legal career here in Montana already. In fact, one of the very issues that is so important, particularly in development with water rights, the use of so-called exempt wells or individual wells for development in large subdivision, I took up to the Montana Supreme Court. It's an issue that I have spent more time than I care to think of working on, both in front of the courts and in front of the Montana legislature. I hear the county's concerns. These are not unique. However, what I will say is that water issues, and particularly water availability for any new development, be that through a public water supply system, which has to go through the full permitting process, or through individual wells on individual lots, is heavily regulated by the Montana DNRC and is the purview of DNRC and not the county. One of the board members here tonight stated that these regulations do not address the water issues and also does little to address things like other issues, such as fire, floods, and roads. That is absolutely correct. The 10-acre minimums that are mandated by these regulations for a large portion of the planning area, in fact, widely exacerbate the water availability issue, the fire issue in particular, because you are dealing with large lot development with large swaths of land, which give a great opportunity for weed propagation, particularly when you are limited in your water availability out there for individual wells through the current regulations on so-called exempt wells. So I ask you to think about that. As I said, what's done is done. You've made your recommendations to the county. But with a focus on lot size minimum, you do not address those issues. I will also point out that when we are talking about the water right review that has to happen in order for a new public water supply system to go in, or if you are applying to receive a certificate of groundwater development under the individual well exemption, that DNRC requires on the public water supply systems a demonstration by a preponderance of the evidence in a hearing with opportunity for objection by surrounding water rights holders that you prove both legal and physical availability of the water. In the case of the individual wells, now DNRC has significant guidance on the spacing of those wells and where you can put those. I will also note that when DEQ conducts their subdivision review, that the applicant has to demonstrate the existence of water rights in order to move forward with that DEQ. For the county then to add on top of that, their own review of water availability would only be an additional layer of duplicative regulation. Finally, in discussing concerns about water availability in specific areas, I would commend not only to this board, but to citizens that are concerned to take a look at two options that they have available under Title 85 of the Montana statute. One are the controlled groundwater areas. There was one in place in the North Hills that expired for a large number of reasons. And second, there are the stream depletion zones, which is a recent enactment, I think in 17, it might have been in 15. The legislative sessions get jumbled to me. But again, for more strict groundwater and stream water or surface water rights in those areas that merit it based on water availability. To have water then now become the purview of the county as well, and water availability, as I said, is to add duplicative regulation on top of an already extremely onerous process that you have to go through with the NRC to get water rights. I appreciate the opportunity to make these clarifications on my client's position. I do appreciate the consideration the board had here tonight, particularly the discussion of some of the things that are missing from the zoning regulations that are moving forward. I do sincerely hope that the county commission takes into consideration many of those statements, even if they are not contained in the resolution. Thank you.
Ms. Steinbeck?
I had a quick question. If we ask that the county do water availability studies, does that imply that the county then has regulatory authority over water supplies by simply doing a study to find out where it's more available for zoning?
Planning board chair, planning board members, Member Steinbeck, Peter Caliano for the record. No, I would not concur with that at all. I'd also point out in response to one of the comments made by Ms. St. Lawrence that looking at water rights, as she mentioned, DEQ does versus water availability are not duplicative at all.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Can I ask what item on the agenda we're on right now?
Public comment.
It's my understanding that public comment is supposed to be on any matter not on the agenda. But I guess I'm a little confused why we're continuing to take public comment about the resolution that's already been passed.
Ms. St. Lawrence was asked to save her clarification comments for the final public comment period.
I understand that, Mr. Chair, but I think those clarifications sort of took a turn. While I appreciate the comments and I think that they are important food for thought for this board, I think that they are within the zoning that we have already discussed. And I noticed that more individuals are coming up to make further comments. So I guess I would ask whether we're going to continue to take public comment.
We're now taking public comment on any item that was not on the agenda this evening.
I only have a couple of quick comments. One of them is on whether or not HBIA and HAR actually were part of the growth policy. I've been a member of HBIA for 47 years and a member of HAR for 35 years. I sat in the meeting that you're talking about where they discussed the growth policy. Not once did I hear anything about a 10-acre density request. I've heard several times tonight about flushing out the regulations, and that's what happens. We come to meetings to discuss growth policy or whatever, and the regulations implementing those are flushed out later. And I would venture to say the 10-acre minimum came out of those regulations, not the meetings where HBIA and HAR were attending. I heard nothing about it in all the meetings I attended, and I think they were even in this hotel. The only other question I have is on public hearings and process. And I agree, we need a process and we need to have Robert's Rules of Order or some way to keep order. But it's very difficult to sit here and listen to a misrepresentation, no matter who it's by, without wanting to speak up and clarify it. So I appreciate this opportunity to do so. And I guess I just need to say that I've heard at every meeting that HBIA and HAR were part of the growth planning process and we're approving it. I need to see, and I would like to have somebody of the staff send me the record that says HBIA approved a 10-acre density, because they did not. I've been there a long time, and I know we would never go forward with a 10-acre minimum density. So thank you for the opportunity to clarify that. I appreciate the comments from the board members tonight about listening to our comments and trying to do some additional things to maybe address some of them. I will remain forever opposed to countywide zoning like this because it simply does not do the planning that it should have done to implement the zoning, because there are many areas in that Lewis and Clark zoning district that can sustain development adequately and professionally and still create a good community. I just think this is unfair, the way in which it's been done, and that's countywide zoning, not good. Thank you for your time.
Do we have a Zoom comment?
We do not.
Okay. Do we have any further public comment?
Mr. Chairman, members of the planning board, George Harris from the Howell Association of Realtors, Chief Executive Officer. I just want to echo what Mr. Hammond has said. He was here during that period. I was not, but I did take a look on page 26 of the original document. And it is true that Howell Association of Realtors and the area realtors were participants. However, at no point, as has been clarified, did they indicate or support a 10-acre minimum. Also, I'd like to reference Mr. David Brandon, who has testified this evening. He was a board member, and he has verified with me that our association at no point supported the 10-acre minimum. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Is there any further public comment? Hearing none, this meeting is adjourned.